Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and very good night, everyone. For your information, Prof, in Malaysia, currently we are at night, 9:30 p.m.
Yes.
How are you, Prof? How are you, Prof? Are you okay?
I'm fine. I'm fine.
Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah. Okay, inshallah. So, Prof, for today, we'll be having some conversations with you on the topic of critical issues in Islamic studies. And for everyone involved today, for your information, everyone, this program is actually another program by Tradisi, of which we will be having conversation with the finest minds of Islamic scholars and also philosophers in Islamic philosophy. And before we'll be giving you chances to ask our beloved speakers, we'll be having some conversations relating to the current issues in their field, inshallah. So, Prof, the first question that I would like to ask you is, from your perspective, what is the meaning of Islamic studies? Does it have a different interpretation in every ages, or does it just the same, or does it also different between places and so on? Can you give us perspective on that issue?
Well, thank you for the question. From my point of view, the conjunction of these two words, Islamic and studies, is an academic subject because studies signifies the academic research. And Islamic studies is not the same as Islamic theology or the creation of Islamic teachings from within the tradition. And so it is an enterprise in which people may engage without regard to their particular orientations. In other words, I think of this in terms of the academic study of religion as it is practiced in the United States, where it is not the replication of the authority of a particular community or text or tradition, but it is an inquiry that puts religion into the category of analysis from the viewpoint of history, literature, social science, art, and other intellectual categories. So Islamic studies does not necessarily engage in defense of a particular religious point of view, nor does it criticize any other particular point of view. But it should be an open-minded, fair-minded, intellectual discussion in which people may participate whether they are Muslims or not, but whether the requirement is to agree that this is a subject of importance and that it can be investigated by academic means. So that's my brief description of what Islamic studies signifies to me.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your answer. I think your answer is very short, but it's precise to the point, where it's actually more academically inclined, if I'm not mistaken, listening to your question. Listening to your answer, sorry. Okay, Prof, can we proceed to the next question, inshallah?
Yes, the next question.
Yeah, okay. So you have already explained to us what Islamic studies signifies to you. So from your own point of view, Prof, can we know what are the main challenges facing Islamic studies today?
Well, the challenges that we face are several. On the one hand, there are political forces at work in the world today which are hostile to the Islamic presence, and this is part of the Orientalist tradition, and it's also what we have more recently learned to call Islamophobia. In other words, a opposition to Islam, a hostile attitude on the part of people who may be secular or may belong to another religious tradition, but this makes it complicated. And the Orientalist tradition is also there because it is an objectification of Islam as being other than the so-called West. And this kind of conflictual apparatus of thought, the conflict of civilizations, the clash of civilizations, is not very helpful to understanding. So, in addition, there are ideological movements within Islamic circles which are adamant about insisting on a particular point of view which they wish to impose on everyone. This sometimes shows striking similarities to Orientalist thought. They are agreed in their approach to texts which can only have one meaning, and they are the only ones who can decide what that meaning is. And so this is a kind of interesting parallelism between the so-called fundamentalist extremists in Islamic circles associated with terms like Salafi and others. And they are also agreed upon in an interesting kind of philosophy of history, which is to say the notion of Islamic civilizational decline. The notion of decline is a very, I should say, tendentious attitude. In other words, it's trying to say that there's something wrong and it needs to be fixed. The Orientalists, the colonial powers, had one idea of how to solve the problem of decline, which was colonialism. The fundamentalist has another point of view, which is to control the state in the name of their own ideology. So these are all interesting and complicated situations. Islamic studies, I think, can best be served by upholding ethical ideals that are not necessarily reduced to any particular religious point of view. I'm hopeful that conversations like the one we're having today will be helpful to create communities that have an ethical formation and which are not limited to any particular ideological perspective. I realize that was another compact answer.
Okay, Prof. I think that is very comprehensive answer, and I believe everyone gained some insights from your answer. I heard about Orientalism in Islamic studies, of which you mentioned that today's Islamic studies is actually kind of product of Orientalism. So I want to ask, from your perspective, how can we avoid the trap of Orientalism in the Islamic studies?
Well, first of all, I think we should abandon the large identity formations. In other words, we should refrain from thinking of Islam as a thing or as an actor. If you observe carefully, you will notice people will say things like, Islam says that such and such is the truth. Now, Islam does not say anything. Islam is not an actor, it's not a person. There are different Muslims who say things which they believe are authoritative. But we should try to get away from what we call the essentialization or the reification or the objectification of religion. I'd like to make an important methodological point. Anything that has a history has undergone change. And anything that undergoes change has no essence that is fixed. The term Islam is a term that exists in social reality, but it has had many different meanings and definitions. And the context is very important. So we should avoid essentializing Islam. Likewise, we should avoid essentializing the West. I can recall times when I have been in Southeast Asia where people have told me that the main problem with the West is that it is atheistic and anti-religious. This is actually a complete mistake. The problem we have in America and other countries in Europe and North America is not that people are atheists. Our religious problems are that people have too much of a certain kind of religion. And so basically what we have to avoid is the notion that East and West are opposites, because there is an Orientalism, there's also an Occidentalism. Both of those have very significant fallacies and mistakes. So instead of making the grand sweeping generalizations, I think what Islamic studies can benefit from most is interrogating individual cases, particular movements, moments in a certain culture and history. And for instance, I mean, since we're having this conversation with an organization in Malaysia, I think there's something very important about the culture of Southeast Asia. And it's not the same as the culture of the Arab countries. So people need to have the ability to understand the local conditions. And these are not reducible to some kind of abstract notion of religion. So I think that's basically where I would begin to discuss how to get beyond Orientalism, is to avoid the big sweeping generalizations and to have the ability to listen closely to local individual cases, and then bring them into a larger discussion based upon analytical concepts.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your answer. I believe that I also heard that you mentioned fundamentalism in many parts of your answer. So I want to ask also, how does this fundamentalism actually manifested in our Islamic culture and Islamic studies today? And does it and how does we can avoid from being too fundamentalistic in Islamic studies?
Well, this is an example of an analytical concept which we can use in a comparative fashion. An analytical concept means that we take a term that is recognized as existing in social reality, and then we clarify it through theory. We are specific about the way we use it, and then we can use it more broadly. The basic elements of fundamentalism, as explored in social science and in religious studies, have been helpfully summarized by my friend and colleague Bruce Lawrence in a book called Defenders of God. Notice the title of that book, Defenders of God. It ironically implies that God is not defending himself. So these people are taking on a particular authority and a particular claim to the ability to speak. And this has arisen in modern times. The term fundamentalism was coined in reference to Christian movements that evolved in the United States in the early 1900s. They were principally motivated by their opposition to two things. One was the Darwinian teachings of evolution in biology, and the other was the application of historical and critical methods to the study of the Bible. Both of these were rejected by the fundamentalists. And they are, in effect, secondary male elites. Secondary elites means they are not in power, but they would like to be. And they are male because they're dominated by masculine authority. They draw their authority from a scripture, a sacred book or tradition, which they claim to be the only ones able to interpret correctly. And there's an interesting displacement in dialogue with a fundamentalist. Tell me if you've had this experience. Someone comes up to you and says, I'm not telling you this. God is telling you this. Now, that's a pretty large claim. And in fact, if anyone is observing this conversation, they would say, actually, you are telling him this. But you're pretending that God is in the authority here. So the fundamentalist is also opposed to the authority of the secular state. The nation state is a very powerful form of political organization, which is barely 200 years old. It replaced the feudalistic monarchies around the world pretty much. There are still traces of them existing in different countries, but they are not anywhere near the power they used to be. And so the secular state is the one that is claiming the authority to rule us all. And they want to have the, as Kant put it, the monopoly on legitimate use of violence. So fundamentalist groups have the potential to challenge that by claiming to have an authority that is authorized by God. Ironically, again, the rhetoric of fundamentalist authority is only meaningful in the context of the nation state. And if we look at examples where a country declares itself to be an Islamic state, such as Iran, notice that it has a constitution in which there is an executive, legislative, and a judicial branch. And in some of the diagrams which depict this nation state, you will see an organizational chart. And you will see the president is in the executive, and the Supreme Court is in the judicial, and the parliament is in the legislative. And then they will put, in Iran, they put the hidden imam, the Prophet Muhammad, and God at the top of the organizational chart. This is kind of amazing. But what's interesting about it is it's the state that's declaring itself to be religious. And so it's not religion that is declaring the state. So to say it is an Islamic state is a rhetoric that is deceptive, because it is the voice of the state that is making this claim. So fundamentalism exists in this modern context of the nation state, secularism, and authority. And so what we have to be careful about is claims of uncontestable authority. If there are people who tell you that they are the only ones who can interpret the Quran or the Hadith or whatever it might be, and that everyone else is wrong, this is a potentially difficult situation, because you can't really have a conversation. So I think, again, steering away from the grand generalizations and also being attentive to the power of rhetoric to assert authority over other people. If you meet someone who is insisting on this point of view, I think the best thing to do is to say, well, what about all these examples? And look at examples after example of particular human beings who are struggling with these things. People who have written as philosophers, as Sufis, as legal scholars, or the like. And I think that you will find that there is a tremendous amount of diversity within the Islamic tradition. And I would also like to mention a book I've just been reading, which I found very interesting. It's by a German scholar named Thomas Bauer, and it is called A Culture of Ambiguity. And it's about the meaning of ambiguity in Islamic culture. And it's a fascinating book. And it, for instance, many of you are familiar with the term, what is said to be a hadith, al-ikhtilaf rahmatun li ummati. Difference of opinion is a mercy for my creation, for my community. This is an interesting statement, and I think it is a helpful resource to understand the diversity of opinion in Islamic thought, in Islamic law, in Islamic philosophy, and Islamic theology. So fundamentalism wishes to reduce everything to a single unity, which they're in charge of. Be careful.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your answer. Well, I believe that everyone understand from your answer about the manifestation of fundamentalism in Islamic culture. So, Prof, I want to ask also about the modernity in the Islamic perspective. So, what are the different ways in which modernity has been interpreted in the Islamic world?
Well, the big experience and the big problem is colonialism. As I'm sure you're all well aware, this was an enormous episode in recent history, and beginning roughly around 1800, but with a lot of preparation in the preceding couple of centuries, European countries conquered militarily the vast majority of Muslim-majority populations. In other words, from Southeast Asia to Central Asia to Africa to Middle East, the Balkans, Central Asia. All these regions where there were Muslim populations were basically conquered. By 1920, there were 4 countries that had not been conquered by outside powers. Those were Iran, Arabia, Turkey, and Afghanistan. And if we think about the history of those countries, they've been deeply embroiled with the economic, political, and educational trajectories of European countries. When the French, the Dutch, the British, whoever it might be, established control over a region, they would impose criminal law and commercial law in a system of their own invention. They permitted what they called custom and local religion to rule in the situations of family law and inheritance and divorce and matters like this. And I remember, as an example of this, when I was in Malaysia some years ago, I visited many of the old Malay capitals. And in the museums, there was always a display in a glass exhibition case of treaties signed between the British and the local Malay monarch. And what was interesting is the British would take control over politics, over law, over military affairs, and the kings would have control of custom and religion. And so this is the way things were divided up. So what this means is that in many countries, educational systems were imposed using the colonial language like French, English, Dutch. And generations of elite locals were trained to think like Europeans. They were also educated, they were told that their civilization was inferior, that they were retrograde, that they were not scientific, they were not modern, they were superstitious. And so there were 2 different responses to this. One was to accept this and to internalize these concepts that were imported from Europe. And the other was to reject it utterly. But they were both doing the same thing in a different way. They both were accepting the worldview of the colonial authority. When colonial missionaries were attempting to spread Christianity in different forms, they would always criticize the local religious traditions, whether it be Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, or whatever. And so they would use all kinds of negative arguments about why this religion was bad. When people stepped forward to defend their religion, they were unwittingly agreeing to the concept of religion that was used by the colonial powers. So they, in effect, unconsciously began to reshape their identity by using European concepts. Let me give you an example. There's a very good book by a scholar named Charles Tripp called Islam and the Moral Economy. This is about the introduction of the concept of society into Arabic. Society is a modern concept that was developed by social thinkers like Herbert Spencer and Karl Marx in Europe in the early 19th century. The term society was introduced into Arabic as ijtima or mujtama. And it was very quickly adopted, and people began to speak about Arab society and Muslim society, not really realizing that they were using a European concept to define themselves. And in so many fields, in science, in religion, in culture, in art, in politics, the concepts of European modernity were introduced. There is a whole range of these, and intellectuals struggled with this. And not only Muslims, but for instance, in China, there was a big debate about the concept of religion. And many intellectuals did not agree that religion was a way to describe themselves. They thought that philosophy was more attractive because they thought that the way that Europeans used religion was something that was for the common people. And so this is an interesting example of how do you struggle with that. I think that in the same way, modern Muslim reformers such as Muhammad Abdu were in deep conversation with Orientalists and European colonial figures. And so they ended up thinking about themselves in terms of European modernity without realizing that something had changed dramatically. So modernity has to do with the state, it has to do with law, it has to do with gender, it has to do with economics, it has to do with biology, it has to do with communications. There's a whole assembly of powerful tools. And there's an intellectual apparatus that goes along with this, and it's impossible to completely ignore this. But if you absorb it uncritically and then turn it into your own way of thinking, something has happened to you, and it has happened without being noticed. So this is the predicament of modernity.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your answer. Um, this is another question that I would like to ask. Is actually an extension of the previous question. So, Prof, in your opinion, what are the implications of the tension between modernity and tradition for the future of Islam? As we know, right, in many parts of the Islamic world, some people wanted to change the tradition to more modern way. Some people want to keep the tradition as it is. So, do you have any opinion on the tension between modernity and tradition for the future of Islam?
Well, I think what's necessary is a kind of critical reflection on this, which is not either a complete rejection or a complete capitulation. And I think that there's a model for this in earlier Islamic history with figures in the intellectual traditions of law and philosophy. And Islamic law, for instance, was completely permeated by the introduction of logic, which is a Greek science that was pre-Islamic and was nevertheless integrated into the practice of ethics and law. And if one examines the methodology of scholars like al-Ghazali, one sees that the Greek philosophical tradition has been taken very seriously. At the same time, it has been put into a dialogue with Islamic theology. And so actually the term theology is a Greek term, you know. So you can't avoid it. What this means is that the simple assertion of authority is not sufficient. And I'll give you an example. One of the important modern thinkers in South Asia was Muhammad Iqbal. He's probably well known to many of you. Iqbal studied in Europe, and he took seriously the contemporary philosophers. He studied the works of Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, of Alfred North Whitehead, and others. And he realized that they were making important discoveries about thought and nature and society and politics that had to be taken into account. And so, ironically, Iqbal has been turned into an authority, and he is treated as somebody who is somehow an ideal, can't be criticized, and must be hero worshipped. this is not very helpful. My colleague Ibrahim Musa describes the process of treating authorities as perfect and untouchable as mummification. They're turned into mummies. They're treated as if they never had a doubt. They never struggled. They always were right. They simply were correct and must be treated as authorities. This is not helpful. If people wanted to be doing something as creative as Muhammad Iqbal today, they would have to be looking at all of the contemporary issues about how do we read a book? What is literature? What is philosophy? What is a text? And what does anthropology tell us about the way people act? What does sociology tell us? And I think an interesting example of this was the Algerian thinker, the Egyptian thinker, for instance, Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, who is well known for his work on Quranic studies as well as Sufism. And he basically says we can't ignore these discoveries that have been taking place in all these fields, and we must apply them. So literature has so many tools, anthropology has so many tools. I have found that it's been extraordinarily helpful for me to go to conferences where I attend lectures on things that are outside of my specialty and ponder about how they might be fruitfully applied. So I would say that the engagement with debates about deconstruction, with debates about the fundamentals of metaphysics as they've been questioned by modern thinkers, if you don't engage with those, you duck it, and there is one response which is like the ostrich, which puts its head in the sand. But anyway, I think that a serious engagement with modern science, philosophy, culture, art is essential in order to have a responsible new position, and no one can do it by themselves. This has to be done in conversation with a community. And so that's why it's so important for scholars and intellectuals across the world to engage together so they can push this kind of agenda forward. We could talk about more specific examples if you want. Actually, let me mention one, Muhammad Arkoun. Now, both he and Abu Zaid have been attacked by conservatives and in a very hostile and frightening way. They are described as not being Islamic because they engage with modern philosophy and literary theory and the like. So there you see the tyranny of authority being directed against people who have the nerve to step out and ask questions. But I admire both of these individuals very much. I had the fortune to meet with them and become familiar with their works. And I think that they were representative of the possibilities of being a courageous intellectual, the ability to ask questions and dig deeply into the sources in order to seek new solutions. So that's a very brief summary of that situation.
Thank you so much, Prof. I believe your answer is very comprehensive, and it's not only comprehensive, but it's easy for everyone to digest the answer, because the tradition in Islam is in so, I can say maybe easy way for people to understand. So, Prof, you are an experienced scholar, and you have mentioned that the Islamic tradition, Islamic intellectual tradition, is actually have individuals which help to contribute into this tradition, developing it, adding new things, and so on. So, what do you think is the best future formula for the Islamic studies from your point of view as an experienced person in the field?
Well, I would encourage people to look in their own backyard. I think that in Malaysia, Indonesia, and surrounding countries, there is a very strong cultural tradition which has many beautiful resources. And just to give you a couple of examples, it's important to defend these treasures. And for instance, Southeast Asia has a tradition of architecture which is its own, and it's very different from the Middle East. I'm thinking about a very old mosque in Kelantan, which I visited, which was built in the 1700s. It does not look like a mosque from the Gulf. It employs local materials, local aesthetic concepts, and seems very appropriate in its location. But because of international Salafi movements, many people have been persuaded that they're not being Islamic enough unless they imitate the Arabs. And I think that is unfortunate. Another example, Southeast Asia also has a rich cultural tradition which includes music. And they have scales and musical traditions which are very rich. Now, one of the very popular activities that takes place among Muslims in Southeast Asia is the Quran recitation competitions. And there is a lot of interest in this, and as you may be aware, I'm sure you much more than I am even, these are very exciting and followed very closely by people, and so this is quite interesting. But what is surprising is that after the introduction of recordings of cassette tapes in the 1980s, the local musical scales in which the Quran used to be recited were replaced by Arab maqam melody scales. And so this might seem like a small thing, but as an observer, I felt that it was kind of strange that a local tradition of singing the Quran, reciting the Quran in particular style, was abandoned and taken over by another one which was imported because of this kind of political loyalty that was being enforced. So I think that being familiar with your own location is very important. Where do you come from? What is your environment? What are the treasures that are found in your tradition? So that's something I would begin with. And also, then this means the literature in Jawi, in old forms of Malay. This deserves to be cultivated, and important thinkers need to be rescued from oblivion, because there are many writers whose works have never been printed that deserve to be understood. So this is one thing that I think would be very helpful. And I noticed that in University of Malaya, where I was affiliated for a semester, there was a separate departments of Islamic studies and separate department of Malay studies. And they had very different points of view. They have not had the conversation that would permit them to have a comprehensive inquiry into the sources of Southeast Asian Islamic tradition, because the Islamic studies institutions are very authoritative. They're focused on Arab sources, and one of the things that's kind of striking about fundamentalism is that it regards culture as the realm of the inauthentic. Now, the problem is there is no society on earth that is 100% Muslim or that has no culture. They're all refracted through an environment which has a completely different sensibility. When I go to West Africa, I see something that is very different in terms of the the local practices. But they have a very strong tradition, not only of reciting Arabic, but also of poems in local languages like Wolof and Hausa and others. And so for them, it's very important to have touch with the heartbeat of their own tradition. And I would suggest this is true in each different region. It is not a question of imposing something from outside, but reaching within. And so that's something that I think is very important. And then if you can use that as a basis for engaging with the intellectual debates about literature, orality, what is oral culture, about art and society, and how is that related to other things? Those are the kinds of situations that I think would be most effective. And I think it would be a rich discovery for many to return to the traditions of their ancestors and take advantage of all the wealth that was preserved there.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your answer. There's another question that I would like to ask regarding one of the most popular, well, I can say areas in Islamic studies about Sufism, of which I believe that you are also an expert in Sufism. So, can you give your opinion on where is the position of Sufi studies in the Islamic studies today? Is it neglected or is it overrated, or do you have any opinion regarding Sufism in Islamic studies today?
Well, that's a good example. Now, Sufism, let me make an interesting distinction here from the beginning. We have a word in Arabic, which is tasawwuf, which basically means, in its grammatical form, the process of becoming a Sufi. And we have an English word, Sufism, and it has an ism on the end, which means it's an ideology. It's one of the words which is used to catalog the philosophies and doctrines of the world. And that's two different things. So tasawwuf is an insider concept. And it basically is about the ideals that are created by imaginative figures who can express things in a way that others can begin to imagine different possibilities. Let me give you an example. There are many different descriptions of tasawwuf in the early literature, but this is a typical example. A Sufi is someone who prefers others to himself. That's an interesting little definition. It's very simple. Now, you may not know anyone who fits that perfectly, but you can imagine it. So this is an ideal. And much of the teachings of Sufism is about ethics, about adab, about possibilities of the spirit. So that is very interesting. Whereas Sufism is an outsider's description of social groups, institutions, rules, texts, literary works, cultural products, architecture, etc. So it is part of the apparatus of the intellectual study of religion and culture. So why is this interesting? Well, first of all, like everything else, Sufism has a history. It has undergone dramatic changes. It started off as a group of individuals that were loosely associated. It became consolidated about the 12th century into social organizations that were sustained by the patronage of feudalistic dynasties. And that lasted pretty well up until the time of colonization in the 19th century, when European powers overthrew the authorities of the monarchies of the Middle East and Asia and replaced them with the colonial state. This removed the support that traditionally had been given to the Sufi orders. And so dramatic examples of this, 1925, Kemal Ataturk, the nationalist hero of Turkey, abolished all the Sufi orders. They were a threat, along with the caliphate, the sultanate, the Arabic alphabet, and all the rest. So that was the secular state abolishing the Sufi orders. In Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Sufi orders are suppressed and very quiet because they are viewed as with great hostility by the fundamentalist state. In other countries, the governments are very careful to regulate the Sufi shrines because they're very big centers of popular enthusiasm still. People attend the shrines of Ahmad al-Badawi in Egypt. In Senegal, I've been to the shrine of Ahmadou Bamba, which has 2 million visitors that show up every year for the festival of the saint. That's almost the same as the Hajj in Mecca, but it's local. So it continues to exist, but in most cases, the Sufi orders of the past are no longer existing in the same way that they were. And so Sufism is discussed on television. It is on the internet. It is criticized by conservatives. I remember when I was at the University of Malaya in 2005, it was agreed that I would organize a conference on Sufism. But we were told by the administration that we could not use that term because it was too controversial. So they said, you can call it spirituality. So we did. And that was kind of interesting. So Sufism is contested because it's been criticized by modernists who replicate the European Orientalist perspective. And so they call Sufism superstitious, anti-scientific, anti-modern, etc. And likewise, it's criticized by fundamentalists and by Wahhabis as being idolatry, not Islamic, and similar types of allegations. In effect, I think in a way, Sufism became so popular in the late early modern period that people were furious at their social control. If you were in Mecca and Medina in the early 18th century, all of the sheikhs were affiliated with Sufi orders. But if you declare them to be infidels and idolaters, you can take over their resources and replace them as the rulers of society. So that's one of the things that happened. So then Europeans became interested in Sufism and created the study of Sufism as part of the colonial Orientalist procedures. And they said that, well, Sufism is kind of interesting because there's poetry and they talk about love and wine and all kinds of things. And so they liked it. So they said, this is really delightful, but so it cannot possibly be connected to Islam because Islam is boring and dry and legalistic. So Sufism must come from somewhere else. So they said Sufism comes from India, it must come from yoga, or perhaps Greek philosophy or the New Testament or something like that. And so you have all these debates today. Is Sufism Islamic? Well, it all depends. And in the modern world, identities can be reconfigured in ways which were never conceived of before. Well, actually, it's true that there were non-Muslims who engaged with Sufism in the past. For instance, the Jewish philosopher Maimonides had a grandson who became very deeply involved in Sufism and wrote in Arabic about topics that were very familiar to those who study Sufism. The Christian thinker Ramon Lo read the same types of works, and he wrote in a Spanish dialect, Catalan, works about the theory of love as proposed by Sufis. And in India, beginning probably the 17th century, because of the translations of lots of Sanskrit works of philosophy and metaphysics into Persian, many Hindu intellectuals became interested in Sufism. They became very familiar with it. And I have one text that was written in about 1800 by a Hindu scholar, which was a commentary on the Arabic poetry of Ibn Arabi. So that's an example of engagement with Sufism by non-Muslims. Today in America, there are Sufi groups that do not have much to do with Islamic norms and practices and doctrines, but are very much engaged with certain parts of the Sufi tradition. Now, it is not up to the scholar to say this is legitimate or not legitimate, because the scholar is not an imam. So what the scholar is expected to do is to talk about the consequences of these positions. So there's a group that's named after Hazrat Inayat Khan, who was a very interesting Sufi teacher from India in the early 20th century. And he went to Europe and America as a musician, and he attracted a great number of followers. And the organizations which derive from him are the largest Sufi groups in America. And so this is part of the fabric of modern society and religion and culture. And in the same way, other terms can be appropriated in unexpected ways. For instance, there's a group called Jews for Jesus. There are Jewish authorities who think this is unacceptable, but speaking from a social reality perspective, they exist. And you can't just say that they are insignificant and don't mean anything. So Sufism is a term which is going to continue to be around, but it doesn't mean the same thing as it did 200 or 300 years ago. I think it's best to regard it as a repertoire, a big reservoir of practices, of teachings, of literary constructions, of aesthetics that are often configured in terms of music. One of the biggest exports today for culture relating to Sufism is Sufi music. And in India and Pakistan, for instance, the Qawwali type of music, which is adapted from the traditional Sufi Sama that is performed in the shrines, is immensely popular. And I've shown videos to my students that have been, if you look in the corner, it says 250 million people have watched this video. Now, I have some bad news for all of us. None of us on this call is going to have 250 million views. But some of these Sufi music performers are evidently way more popular than we are. So that's just a little joke. But so I think it's worth examining the way in which this Sufi tradition is reevaluated and applied in modern situations. And I think there's something to be learned from this. And part of it has to do with the emphasis on ethics, which I think is something deeply necessary in all of our societies. The other thing to say is that, as I mentioned before, with respect to looking at the Malay intellectual tradition, much of the writings of the past remain in manuscript. They've never been printed. There are many fascinating and important works of Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Urdu, Malay, Wolof, which have never been studied properly. And I think that there is some benefit to be gained by going into these traditions and bringing them out in a way which is accessible to others. So I would encourage people who are interested in this type of work, and I see a couple of names I'm familiar with on our group here today, And I know that many of you are interested in trying to understand the text of the past. So I would encourage you to persist.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your answer. Well, I believe that this is the last question that I would ask before opening the session for the audiences to ask questions to you, inshallah. Okay, Prof, I want to ask, not ask, but I would like to ask the advice that you would give to young people who are interested in pursuing a career in this field. Do you have any advices for us?
Well, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. And part of the challenge is economic. If you want to be able to study this type of material as an academic, it means you need to search for an academic program for an advanced degree, a PhD or something like that. And then you have to find a job. This is not always easy. And I don't have an exact recipe that I can promise is foolproof for doing this. I have trained quite a few graduate students, and many of them are doing extremely well, thankfully. But you have to look very carefully at the professional opportunities, because there are some institutions in the Southeast Asian region which are very conservative, and others which are more open-minded. So everyone has to find out what is their own tolerance, what is their own requirement for how much do you need to feel like you have the authority to do your own investigation, and is it possible within the framework of existing institutions? So it's not done lightly, because an academic profession is probably not the best way to make a lot of money. But this is perhaps already known to you. But if you're going to do it, you have to do it very seriously and take on not only the linguistic expertise, the intellectual expertise, but you have to be sensitive to the politics of the situation, the politics of the academic world. Sometimes it's possible to gain admission with a scholarship to an institution which will provide you with freedom and resources that you could not find elsewhere. But it's not easy. So I don't wish to dismiss lightly the challenges that are facing us. But if you find yourself in a situation where you really feel like you have to pursue this subject because you are motivated to do so, form connections. Don't be on your own. Connect to people in your own environment, in your own institutions, and try to find opportunities to go elsewhere and to learn from others. If you can find resources to go to other countries, whether it be in East Asia, in Europe, in North America, but also don't forget the kind of South-South connections. In other words, you don't have to go always to the metropole, to London, Paris, New York. You can go to Istanbul. You can go to Rabat. You can go to Dakar. I had the opportunity to organize a conference in Dakar several years ago. And I have some good friends in Turkey who are involved in Sufi studies. And so I invited them to take part and to come to Senegal, and they were very surprised by what they found. Because Senegal is a country where 90% of the population belongs to Sufi tariqas. And yet it's a very different flavor of everything. Everything has got its own background. But I felt it was very important to bring those Turkish people to be able to speak with the Senegalese people about music, about Sufism, about culture. And I think it was very productive as a result. So community is absolutely essential to the performance of good academic work. So I would encourage people to become familiar with your own institutions, with their resources and their possibilities, as well as their shortcomings, and take advantage of opportunities to enlarge your circle of community. And I wish you all success.
Thank you so much, Prof. Carl W. Ernst, for your amazing insights and also answers to my questions. Inshallah, we'll be opening the room and the floor to the audiences to ask anything, or even to share experiences, or maybe to share some insights from your own perspective to Prof. Carl Ernst on today's topic. So everyone is invited to open your mic, and if you have the chances, please open your camera if your internet connection is strong. Do so. We welcome you all to ask the questions, inshallah. Go on, Nuruddin.
Yes, can you hear me, brother? So
Yes.
yeah, thank you. Very interesting discussion, Prof. Carl. Maybe I have several questions, Prof, for you. My first question maybe this is about the revisionist school of Islamic studies, like Patricia Kron, David Cook, and some other thinker. What do you think, Prof, about their approach to Islamic studies? It is still part of Orientalism, or what do you think about the school of revisionists?
Well, I don't find the researches of Cronin Cook to be extremely helpful to my work. It is hypothetical, it is provocative, it is deliberately challenging a lot of things in ways which don't really help me to make much progress. And so I'm speaking both in terms of issues like, for instance, the hypercritical approach to the Quran and early Islamic history that in some ways perpetuates the Orientalist impulse to discredit authorities and propose a theory of decline. Or even some of the suggestions are even more outlandish. So in brief, I don't find that to be something I recommend necessarily to my students, although one needs to be aware of the debates and what the consequences of those debates are. But I guess that's how I would end. It's not something which I have really found beneficial.
Yes, Prof. Thank you. I have a second question, Prof. I want to know, Prof, about the influence of Nasser approach, Saint Nasser approach on Islamic studies in America, and what do you think about his approach? So, because you mentioned about the Western and Eastern dichotomy, and I think Saint Nasser is very strong on emphasizing the secularism aspect of the Western civilization, for example. But he also says that the secularization also happened in the East. What do you think about his approach to Islamic studies, I think, or also Islamic philosophy? What do you think?
Well, I've known Sayyid Hossein Nasr for many years. He actually published my dissertation, and we have a cordial relationship, and that is something which I value. But I have a serious disagreement with him in terms of philosophy, and philosophy of history in particular. Because the perennial philosophy, or the traditionalist perspective, which he is attached to, I find this to be a problem, in the sense that it is a response to colonialism from within the conservative right wing of European thought itself. Traditionalism is a term that arose within the extreme right wing of the Catholic Church in the 1800s. And it was adopted by a group of intellectuals around 1900, like René Guénon, and later on Fridtjof Schuon, and ultimately Said Hossein Nasr, many of whom turned out to be Muslims or had converted to Islam, like, excuse me. And the problem is that it is an authoritarian statement, that there is only one particular understanding of religion and they have it. Furthermore, it's a devolutionistic philosophy of history in which everything is declining from the pristine revelation until modernity, which is the realm of evil. And they refuse to engage with history because history is not meaningful within this perspective. I'm too much of a historian to accept that. And so the perennial philosophy also it avoids the significance of the individual articulation of experience. Everything has to be understood in terms of broad symbolic categories. So I think that the problem is that people who have been negatively impressed with the Orientalist aggression, with the arrogance of European scholarship, they end up taking a reverse Orientalist point of view. And so that's when the West becomes viewed as atheist. And instead of, the colonial perspective is that the West is modern scientific and the East is backward in superstition. So the perennial philosophy turns this around. The West is atheistic and degraded, and the East is spiritual. Well, I'm sorry, I think there are people who are spiritual in both Asia and America. And there are people who are intellectually limited in both of those regions too. So I just want to get away from all these East and West dichotomies. And I like to tell people there is no Muslim world. There is no separate planet that is only inhabited by Muslims and is unconnected to Europe and America. We're all connected. So let's get over it. So the perennial philosophy is, I have to admit, when I read Guénon many years ago, his critique of materialism and the reign of quantity and all that is quite fascinating. But the big picture that he paints is not really acceptable. So I don't really employ it. And I tell my graduate students, read some history and some social sciences, and you're going to be much better off.
Yes, Prof. Very interesting, Prof. I have another question, Prof. If I'm not mistaken, you are also talking about the idea of civilizational Islam in Malaysia. I want to know, do you think that the person like Najib Alatas and his son Ali Taufik Alatas is similar to perennialist approach in understanding civilization, or maybe they have differences with the perennials, like canon in understanding the civilizational Islam. Do you think, bro?
Well, as I understand it, there was one interesting meeting that took place between Dr. Nasser, between Ismail Farouqi and Sayyid Naguib al-Attaf. They spent a weekend together or something like this, according to this story. And each of them came out with a new separate idea of the Islamization of knowledge, in which he was the authority. I think that there is resemblances between the projects that these intellectuals embarked upon. But the Islamization of knowledge is an ideological framework that I think is not helpful to Islamic studies. And so, with all respect to these people who've made many contributions, I find myself hesitant to endorse any engagement with this kind of metaphysical position which is entertained, which I think is too ideological and takes us away from the texts, from the society, from the cultures that we should be exploring much more in their own terms rather than treating them as part of this war between civilizations. Civilization is a treacherous concept, and it was invented to make Europe superior to all the rest of the world because everyone else is barbarian. But then everyone got jealous and said, we have a civilization too. So they became part of the same project. So I think it's time to move on. But thank you, Nuruddin, for your questions.
Yes, Prof. Maybe this is last question, Prof. You mentioned about the Islamic architecture, Prof, and you says that now in the Southeast Asia, the architecture is similar to Middle East. But I don't want to explore that. I want to asking about is the notion about architecture or Islamic architecture now reduced only about the form, yeah. I think the Islamic architecture or the notion about the art, yeah, is more general, more deeper than that. What do you think, Prof, about this notion of Islamic architecture, Islamic art from I think your experience to study about that?
Was the question about Islamic architecture?
Yes, about Islamic art. I think now the discussion is only about the form, yeah, about the, for example, yes, using the building like the Middle East. I think even, for example, Farouqi does not talking about the form, but about the, for example, the philosophy behind the architecture. What do you think about that?
Well, I think we have to deal with an interesting historical problem. The concept of Islamic art was invented by whom? European art historians. They used to have collections of what they called Arab art, Turkish art, Persian art. They said, well, let's throw it all together and we'll call it Islamic art. And it's Islamic all the way down. So if you go into the Metropolitan Museum in New York, they have candles, they have swords, they have armor, they have horse trappings. Everything is Islamic. Why is that? You don't go into a section of Christian art and find the same kind of, antique store collection. So Islamic architecture the same way. What is Islamic architecture? Does it mean a dome? Does it mean a arabesque? Does it mean calligraphy? You can find exceptions to all of this. And what is an Islamic building? I mean, is it a bank? Is that if everything's Islamic, then nothing's Islamic. So it's interesting that there's something called the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. It's not actually called the Award for Islamic Architecture, but just architecture. And they've had a terrible time defining what their field of research is and who are they going to give a prize to. But they ended up having a definition that some of it has to be art for the Muslim community. But I've seen architecture, Islamic architecture, defined as particular forms. Is it something that's made for a Muslim patron by a non-Muslim artist? Yeah, that happens. If you think about the Dome of the Rock or the Alhambra or the Qasr of Seville, that was made by sometimes by Muslim artists for a non-Muslim patron, sometimes non-Muslim artists for Muslim patron. What about modern art produced in Muslim countries, which has no reference to any traditional form? What about, I mean, you can go on and on. It's a very contradictory subject, and I think that we need some different analytical approaches. Well, I think Nuruddin has done very well, but he's held the field for too long, so it's time to pass the torch.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Prof.
Hello, dear Professor Ernst. Can you hear me well?
Yes, good to see you, Aidan.
Thank you so much. Greetings from Melbourne. I joined the field of Islamic studies, I think now nearly 20 years ago, after encountering your scholarship. So reading your books on the Shatahat, on the ecstatic births, then your publications, excellent publications on Sufi music, on yoga, so on and so forth. So before asking my questions, I just want to thank you for all of the, the mentorship, the guidance that you have provided to, generations of scholars. That is an incredible service that's unmatched in the field. So thank you for being a, shining light to the field. It's amazing. My question is about the path, the research that you are following now. What are you reading nowadays? Yeah.
Mr. Aidogan, I believe that some of your okay, just proceed. I think my gadget is having problem.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my question was about what is the current research of Professor Ernst, very quickly.
Well, I have a book coming out in about 2 weeks, which is a new subject, which is about an African Muslim scholar who was enslaved in the United States in the early 1900s. His name was Omar ibn Sayyid. And we have 18 documents in Arabic that he produced, which are fascinating. And it turns out he was a Sufi, and he's quoting texts such as the poems of Abu Madian and theological writings. And it's just opened up a whole new understanding of this perspective, where we have African Muslim scholars who were slaves in America. And it was right near where I live because he was in North Carolina. So this book is called I Cannot Write My Life. And the subtitle is Islam, Arabic, and Slavery in Omar ibn Sayyid's America. So I'm very happy with this book. I have a co-author who is from Senegal. His name is Mbaye Lo. And so we're very hopeful that this book will open up a new audience to the study of Islam and Sufism in America in a way that was totally unexpected by people in the past. And then I have a couple of translations of texts on yoga that are coming out. And so I've worked on those for a long time, and they're very interesting. So I'm still keeping it. As you may know, I retired a year ago from my position at UNC, but I still have a number of projects. And so thank you for the question. I don't want it.
Sounds very exciting. Looking forward to them, dear Professor.
Okay.
Prof, we have one question from the chat, and the question is privately sent to me. He asks your opinion. This question is from Reza. He asks your opinion about the importance of philosophy in the higher educational institute today. Is it important for philosophy to exist in the higher education today? And does it important to establish a philosophy department or a philosophy institute in the university or so on?
I would say yes, and I think it's really important to have a philosophy department that is broadly connected to multiple traditions of intellectual reflection. I mean, most of the American universities with departments of philosophy have basically two types of philosophy. One is Anglo-American analytical philosophy. The other is continental existential philosophy. That's it. And they might have a little bit of history of philosophy that with something about Plato, something about medieval, but that's about it. That's usually not considered to be very serious. So that's what happens in America. Philosophical writers such as Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, Al-Ghazali, and others were extremely skillful writers and very important thinkers. And we need to understand them in a way which is not authoritarian, but to understand the ways in which they wrote between the lines. And this is something which I feel is extremely important, and it has to be with attention to more than one religious tradition. Because philosophy actually claims to deal with rational aspects of reality, which are not necessarily defined by revelation. So this is a significant problem, and I think you need to be familiar with the broad outlines of the history of philosophy in order to be able to negotiate the debates that happen today. So I would say yes, but it should be broad and not limited and hopefully open-minded. That would be my recommendation. Easy for me to say, but there we go.
Thank you, Prof, for your answer. Well, we are still opening the stage for anyone to ask questions. Please, if anyone has, if wanted to share your experiences with Prof today, you are cordially invited. Or if you want to maybe to criticize him, yes, we also open the
I
stage.
have some critics.
Well, I believe that everyone has critics, Prof, and inshallah, tonight will be a very open-minded critic, inshallah, if there are any critics.
Well, I may have provided far too many complicated answers to your questions, and so if there's nothing further, well, I guess we could close it. I have some things to attend to very shortly, but
Okay.
It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you all, and I hope that it provides some stimulation and some reflections that you find helpful. And so I think you're doing the right thing by creating these conversations that are bringing us together across the oceans, where people of similar minds can reflect together. So I appreciate what you're doing. I wish this organization success in staking out an intellectual position in this location and for the rest of the world as well.
Inshallah. Alhamdulillah, thank you so much, Prof, for your willingness to accept our invitation to do this conversation with us. And I believe that everyone get their share of knowledge that has been disseminated throughout this session. And I believe that everyone is also fascinated to delve more into this field of Islam, philosophy, Sufism, and so on. And I believe that the people that are joining today will also be eagerly wanting to connect with you and also other minds in this field, inshallah. Thank you so much, Prof. And also thank you so much to everyone who are also willing to join our conversations tonight. And for everyone, this is not the only conversation that we will have. Inshallah, for the next months, we will also be having other conversation with other finance minds of the Islam and also Islamic philosophy, inshallah. Thank you, everyone. You can access the recording later on. And that's all. As a representative of Tradisi, I would like to apologize if there are any shortcomings from this program tonight. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, everyone. And I close this session with Wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullah.